Okay, everyone, welcome to the Manifesto Seminar series. This is our third one. Good morning and afternoon and evening and even late evening for those who are joining us from different time zones, especially from Australia. So as you know, some of you it may be the first time you're joining. Welcome even more warmly, but for those of you who have attended this event, this is a follow-up on the manifesto. I believe that you have by now hopefully heard about our endeavor that we took on last year. And we have decided that we had some restricted space for the authors. There are 23 authors on the manifesto to express everything they had to say because we have a limited space. So we decided to, and again, credit to Matt as the idea to have this follow-up seminar series broken down in like 4 events so that the authors can come in and talk more about their topic, or even put, of course, more thoughts and insights to what had to be taken out in the text itself. So the format is relatively simple and informal. We have divided this session, which is called basically the specific topics that we believe need to be recognized and addressed in accounting research and accounting period. So we have 5 topics with actually 7 speakers, I believe. And we're going to have 5 minutes on each topic by each speaker or each group of speakers, starting with feminism, Andy Romai, and so on, as you have seen in the program. And we should be hitting about the 30-35 minute mark after they have all spoken. And then we will have a Q&A from the audience to any of the speakers, really a flowing discussion. You can post your questions on the chat, or you can just hold until the speakers have all talked, and then we can go from there. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Andy Romai, who also was a coordinator of the manifesto, but who also wrote on feminism, and then she'll come back later with people with disabilities. So Andy, on feminism, floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning from here at least. I hope it sounds okay. I am actually traveling. So as I mentioned to some people when I jumped on, I'm in like one of those airport pods. So hopefully it sounds okay. Yeah, so my name is, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrea Romai, and I am an associate professor in accounting at Texas Tech University in the US. And I also act as the co-director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the college. So a lot of these topics are certainly near and dear to my heart that we'll talk about today. But first and foremost, I love the topic of feminism, especially when it comes to accounting, and most importantly, when it comes to the accounting and the academic institutions that we're working at and the way that we conduct research. So first and foremost, when I talk about feminism, I certainly discussing things from a feminine or a female point of view, but I recognize that there are those who non-binary, those along an entire spectrum who recognize or self-identify with females. So, and we also know that a lot of the topics I'm going to talk about will be somewhat repeated today because all of the things that I'm going to discuss and that are discussed in the manifesto are certainly exacerbated when we talk about intersectionalities of different things. So I'm not necessarily the best person to represent this, being a white female of sort of higher socioeconomic status, but it is something that's very important to me. So we all know one of the things that sort of makes me motivates me to talk about these issues is that women still earn less in the workplace. We still represent a very small portion of executives within the business community. One topic I spend a lot of time on trying to move the needle at our institution is that we also represent a smaller portion within the academic community. Sort of similar to the accounting profession and the public accounting profession, females represent about 50%, if not a little bit more, of the tenure track faculty across the globe when we start out. And by the time you get to full professors, we represent only about 34, 35%, which is actually higher than executives. But you know, there's a lot of gender biases, gender and racial biases in the P&T process. So I speak a lot about that. And these are things that I think as accounting academics, we should be spending more time focused on. I think also when we start talking about this from a methodological perspective or from a research perspective, I think there are a lot of issues that we've researched in the past, especially when it comes to accounting, that should be re-examined from what I consider a feminist methodological perspective, in that we should be starting with the margins, starting at the margins and listening to those individuals with lived experiences and what we're looking at, really focusing on who it is that has been affected by some of the oppressions that we talk about and some of the inequities that we talk about in the world, and figuring out how we can solve problems or how we can counter those biases and oppressions based on the lived experiences of those people. So I think that's really important, this feminist methodology and how we approach research. I also think that it's important to keep in mind as we reevaluate things, whether that be through research or whether that be through sort of the policies and procedures at our academic institutions, is that we seem to like to think that everything we do is sort of like evolved over time into the best form, which is not necessarily the case, right? We all used to fly on planes with everybody smoking. So things that we've always done doesn't mean they're always the best ways. So to really reevaluate sort of our institutional policies and procedures, as well as our research and how we can maybe examine things from a different perspective, I think is very important. And just realizing as we approach our research that the structures and the systems that we work in have been developed in this patriarchal, white, heteronormative type of environment, and that the policies and procedures that we work under reflect that. So constantly being critical and questioning those things and trying to approach things from a different perspective with a little bit more focus on those with lived experiences, I think becomes extremely important. So.
Great, thank you, Andy. That was right on time, and I think it will open debates and discussion again, of course, about this. So great. Next, we have Matt Sorolla for accounting for the defense industry, which happens to be quite relevant today. So go ahead, Matt.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everybody for coming today. So I was going to start just by telling you a little bit about myself, the motivations that led me to write this with Cecilia. And then I was going to talk about what was in the article, why we put it in there, and then what was left out of the article. So I was really the driving force behind trying to write this section, and Cecilia was there to kind of help me grind out my ideas. The motivation kind of came. A lot of my academic motivations come from problems that I saw when I was going through university. Anybody that knows my research knows I do stuff with dialogic accounting. The reason I work inside of there is because it challenges a lot of assumptions inside of accounting. And I kind of grounded a lot of my research out of there. Well, with this defense industry section of the manifesto, I was motivated to try and work out a lot of internal conflicts I have with being American, being from San Antonio, Texas, which is 5 military bases. Every part of my family is somehow involved in the military, and knowing that at the same time as like participating in sessions that we have about decolonization and looking at the wars that have, the new wars and the wars that have been going on for the last 20 years, it's kind of difficult for me to separate, to make sense of that from myself. And so a lot of the research that I do is me trying to work these things out. So I was motivated to write this piece in the paper to kind of reflect my own intellectual pursuits and trying to see how to examine this intersection between accounting and the defense industry or the military industrial complex. So what was in the article, well, thankfully, there was a lot that had already been written on accounting and war. I drew a lot from Michelle Schwastiak. I might be butchering her last name, but I think it's Schwastiak. Her work, she wrote some papers with Laura Funnell, Glenn Lehman, Jesse Dillard and Linda Rushela had some work as well that was in there. And basically, I was canvassing kind of these perspectives that had already been built up inside of the accounting literature. And I think something that Andy just mentioned about re-examining topics is kind of the way that I was trying to approach the review of what they'd already written. Something like war and the defense industry, it's a huge topic, and I think it weaves into everything that we do. And it's in trying to write this section, I was trying to cut a small piece out of that to try and say something and move the conversation forward. But there was a lot of work that had been done in accounting, but doesn't seem like we're short of having new conflicts. So this is a space that I think can also be re-examined. And I also wanted to draw attention to one of there's a really great project out of Brown University called the Cost of War Project. It's in the Watson Institute at Brown University, and they do a lot of really, really interesting work trying to quantify these conflicts. And so I was trying to also draw from these other research institutions that we might not that I didn't see inside of the accounting literature that had already been written.
All of this, I should buy one dress.
And why? So there was a lot of good work being done, but it's not very difficult to look around to see the continuation of problems. This newest IPCC report just came out talking about how we drastically need to change everything. We need this to, really reinvent the way that we live. But it seems like the only things that we ever have money for are more wars, more military spending, more development of defense systems. And this is even on the back of still ongoing global health pandemic where millions of people died in the US, but magically we can always find money for war, but we can't find it for anything else. So there was trying to, again, in writing this section, I was trying to start fleshing some of these ideas out. And what was left out of it, there were 3 points really that I couldn't figure out how to kind of nestle into there. One was this the growing economy of the private military complex, military industrial complex, and just this privatization of war. It's not like it's good. Yeah, for better or worse. There's a lot of privatization going on inside of the defense industry, and I think that there are a lot of moral problems that are coming up because of that. There's also, and particularly after COVID-19, I think there's this inability to rationalize progress without the military. And without war, right? Any kind of technological progress or social progress that we have, it seems to be on the back of some sort of military spending package. Even so, in the US, you get told about how NASA was developed out of all of the technological developments of World War II, when all the money was getting put towards building the atomic bomb. In France, when COVID started, Macron had this thing where he would say, "Nous sommes en guerre," like we're at war. The only way to rationalize any kind of like big public response to something is as a war. And I feel like that is a extremely limiting frame to put on human progress. And yeah, the last thing was a lot of this, I'm trying to play a lot with this idea of critical military theory. Which is this all-encompassing, all-dominating idea of how the military operates and how that kind of intersects with the way that we talk about things that are so nuanced, like sustainability and having to find all these nuances. And that was something that I also could not fit into, what was it, 250 words? That was impossible. Well, thank you all. That's it for me.
Thank you, Matt. I feel some emotions. Thank you. So the next topic, I think you have seen them in many places. If you haven't, then you've been missing activity online. But we have the magic trio from Quebec City and Melbourne now. Querying accounting from Alessandro, Nick, and Lisa. I guess you decided on the order that you want to speak. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles, for having us. So yeah, as Charles said, my name is Alessandro. I'm from Quebec, and I'm joined here with Nick and Lisa, who will speak right after me. So yeah, as from Monash University in Melbourne. So exactly our topic on the manifesto was about querying accounting, a project that the three of us have been conducting for quite some time, even on web, online platforms, as well as on Instagram. But what's the idea? The idea is to retrace and embrace the idea of queer. So the old term, the idea that queer as alternative to the norm. So not only as something that has been always a bit considered as second-tier importance, or even considering negative ways towards LGBT. So we embrace this to first queer accounting, and we also have wrote recently another manifesto on this, trying to rethink what accounting could look like, but then also trying to think of how to queer research, education, and engagement. And we have a beautiful picture that an artist made for us in the manifesto on page 10. So I will briefly talk about research, then I will pass to Lisa to talk about education, and Nick about engagement and society more broadly. So the idea of queer accounting from a research perspective concerns both how we see LGBTQI people, so that for a long time has been considered as a stigma, something to hide, but in reality society is changing, and what's happening in the accounting profession, how can we rethink structures and also their power of agents in for LGBTQI accountants, because very often we notice that they will leave the profession or they would just hide. Whereas now we show that sometimes they resist. The second point that we make about querying research is also about the format, how we conduct research. So trying to queer, and again, coming back to the idea of alternative to the norm, how research paper is structured, always like section 2, section 3, now it's basically a toolkit, or what type of data we get it. Now everyone gets 26 interviews, semi-structured. And so we try to push researchers in accounting more broadly to think how to queer research as well. I pass now to Lisa, that she will get a bit more on board about the education and the pedagogy.
Thanks, Alessandro, and hi everybody. It's great to be here tonight here in Melbourne time. So we do quite a bit of work in the education space as well. And as Alessandro mentioned, we draw upon the concept of queering. And this is important because a recent survey found that a significant proportion of LGBTQI young adults identify as queer. So we have potentially a significant proportion of students in our classroom that identify as queer. And many of those students don't get the opportunity to see their identities reflected in the accounting curriculum. So in the education space, we use a lot of critical pedagogy and queer theory to queer accounting education. We do this by identifying the hidden curriculum of heteronormativity and challenging that hidden curriculum in a number of ways. So students use a lot of critical reflexivity to recognise their position within structures of normativity and recognise that we have inequity within those structures. We create space for students to feel discomfort. When students recognise their position relative to others in those normative structures, it can create feelings of discomfort. And we also use imagination and also positive activism. So encouraging students to create spaces beyond heteronormativity where all diverse identities can be celebrated and all students can feel a sense of belonging. So I'll pass now to Nick, who can finish off our presentation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks, Al. The last thing to talk about is a little bit of the engagement in the social spaces. So the three of us do love a bit of activism in very playful and creative ways. And so we felt that this project was a really nice, useful project to kind of push back and activate the accounting profession. And so we try to do that in really humorous ways. We work a lot with artists. Alessandro mentioned that we employ artists to be able to do some of this work. We've used Karen from Finance before in this space to try to really play with humor in a very polite but very critical way to push back against the profession. So we tried to create, what we did realize is that we don't represent the rainbow family. We're very privileged. We're all white and we all come from certain perspectives. So we don't by any means represent that much broader group that is our family. So as a result of that, when we were engaged in the research and working with the accounting profession, we realized that that space doesn't exist for the queer group. The Pride networks are particularly geared towards white cis males. And so we wanted to create a space that would be bringing everybody together. So we worked very closely with the accounting profession as a way to activize space, to be able to create space for people to come into. And so that works across different organizations, the big four, but also small to medium size, to bring them into the accounting professional space that crosses over. So as a result of that, CPA Australia put our work in their integrated report, and they also created their own Pride network within that organization. So we're particularly proud of activities like that and how we've been able to engage and socialize within the industry more broadly. And then we like to do crazy stuff like go to London and deposit the Queering Accounting Manifesto in the Queer Archives over there as well. So thanks, everyone. Happy to take questions later on.
Thank you, the three of you. And again, to come at this very late time. I know Nick came at an event, it was like 2-3 a.m. So today was more reasonable, I guess, but thank you again. I can also attest that they have been guest speakers in my class a couple of weeks ago, and it was fantastic. It was more broad on diversity, but in terms of pedagogy impact, that was great. So thank you again. Next, we're gonna have people with disabilities, and we're gonna have Andy back. And I think she can also speak to the co-author who was instrumental in the Act for Americans with Disabilities. So anyway, I'll let you introduce that topic. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, so especially with this topic, I just want to say early on, again, while I might not be the best representative for feminism, I'm certainly not the best representative for people with disabilities. This was, when we first started the manifesto, we were trying to really brainstorm topics that we thought were important, that maybe hadn't had the focus that we thought they should have at any point, and this topic came up. And I had happened to have just worked on a diversity presentation with Lex, who happens to be an individual with disabilities, who was instrumental, I believe it was in the 70s, in developing the American with Disabilities Act. He was an individual who helped to write the act and helped to get the act passed and to implement that act. So he's an amazing human being. So it was my honor to be able to work with him on developing this part of the manifesto. But again, this is not something that I represent well. So there may be others of you who are certainly more experts in this area, and I welcome you to chime in and provide whatever you might. But individuals with disabilities really represent an autonomous and self-determined group. And this is what I find so fascinating about these individuals. They're constantly fighting for their political and legal rights. Social and cultural legitimacy. We just sort of talked about that with the queering accounting just now, but this idea that whenever an individual with a disability is in the room, that there's some thought that they don't have abilities, that they need help with things, when in all actuality, they're much more able than I am often. So, and they fight for acceptance often, to just be able to be in the room and to participate in a meaningful way like the rest of the individuals do. So they really, which is one of the things I'm struggling with right now, they really prefer to speak for their own self-interest as non-disabled representation really stands in opposition to their goals and self-determination and advocacy and independence and all those amazing things that they're so good at and that they really want. But over the years, clearly decades, they have had a lot of opposition. There's been a lot of obstacles in their way just in everyday work, whether that be physically in their way or whether that be as part of the social interaction that they have, whether that be with laws, the treatment that they have, where, you know, like when an individual, they're put in special housing sometimes, they're put in special areas, when in all actuality, they just need support and structural support to be able to live, you know, autonomous, normal lives. And they really are self-advocates. They really are independent. Unfortunately, many of the obstacles that we think about still remain today. Some of those things are systemic inequities with respect to the fact that they are often face lower incomes than everyone else. They have a much more difficult time attaining education, not mentally attaining education, but often physically, often they're kept out of these spaces just from the ignorance of the individuals who are in charge of admitting. Lower rates of unemployment, higher underemployment, higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, isolation from independent living, like full community immersion. Stigmatization is still huge for them, as I talked about earlier. But I really think that authorship on accounting, if we're going to be focused on issues of disabilities, they really should include, like I said earlier, really going to the individuals with firsthand disability experience, or at least having an individual on the authorship who's a significant consultant in that. And I would say that's how this manifesto portion was done. Lex really was the individual who I put together a little bit of talking points and he went with it. So he knows better than I do. He informed my language. He informed my understanding, which I welcome. I don't mind being, you know, corrected at any point about things. So I was appreciative of that. But it's really now time to focus on the ways accounting, as it has in many things, has been perpetuated oppressions against people with disabilities. And it's really time now to figure out how we can use accounting, whether that be systemically, whether that be in our research, to really help overcome some of those oppressions for people with disabilities, to be able to immerse them fully into community and what they would like to have as part of their lives. It's a rapidly aging demographic. So it needs dissolution of some of these obstacles that we've talked about, and freedom, right? Freedom from all of the obstacles that we're talking about, to really be fully immersed and ever present in what they do and in their lives.
Thank you, Andy. That was a passionate discussion that you started. That was great for disabilities topic. And last but not least, we will have Stuart, who is also a co-coordinator of the manifesto with me, Andy, and Dianlo on the 21st century class and labor perspectives. Stuart.
Cheers, Charles. Thanks for that. And thanks everybody for logging in this afternoon, or whatever time zone it is where you are. So my name's Stuart Smith. I'm a chair in accounting at the University of Sheffield, and I co-wrote the section on class and labour perspectives with Christine Cooper. And I want to start off actually, because we were asked to talk about what's included, with the very first point that we include there, which is a quote from Christine that I insisted on being in there. So just to clarify, Christine wasn't looking to self-reference or anything like that. It was my insistence on it. And that quote actually has stuck with me ever since I read her paper Against Postmodernism that it comes with, or that it's in. And it's particularly, I think, it's still relevant. For those of you who may know, that certainly within Britain and nearby countries will know about what's happened with the P&O workers recently. So P&O is a shipping line, mainly between Britain and the continent, and 800 workers were sacked by pre-recorded video, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Immediately, no consultation with the trade unions or anything like that, completely broke the law. The chief executive was in front of a select committee in the House of Commons and said that we broke the law, and is unrepentant about it, would do it again if he had his time over. Now, how this is relevant is their narrative around sacking these 800 workers and actually bringing in casualised workers who are not on UK contracts, who are on contracts for the country in which the ships are actually registered in, who are all, some of whom are below minimum wage, etc. Their narrative for all of this was that there is £100 million loss that they've made last year. And so straight away, accounting, as we know, is straight in there used to justify the 800 lives and families being devastated by this. But of course, we also know, I'm not telling anything particularly new on this, we also know that actually individual companies are parts of groups. The P&O is part of a group called DP World. DP World last year paid £270 million out in dividends to their shareholders, and indeed actually have spent millions, if not tens of millions or more, actually sponsoring golf tournaments across the globe in the last few years, and also received 14 million from the government in terms of furlough payments during the COVID pandemic. So why are we saying this? Well, those who know some of the literature know that this is not new. We know that accounting is used to justify the distribution of resources, and in this case to protect the shareholders and to sack workers and downgrade working conditions. But the reason I brought out in particular the P&O example is because we felt in writing the piece that class perspectives and labour perspectives are still relevant. It wasn't something just that Christine wrote, you know, when is this, 20 odd years ago now. And it's not something that actually, well, that was what was happening in the 80s when there was a few papers written about trade unions and accounting information and so on. It still goes on today. And class is still relevant today, but it's been under attack for the last kind of 30, 40 years, really from two sides. On the one side, from the kind of the neoliberal theorists and neoliberal advocates who are basically saying class is irrelevant now, right? We don't need to talk about it. We're all entrepreneurs, right? So you don't need class in analysis, and you as an individual, you have your own capital and you just go out there and make the best of your own capital. So you've got that on the one side. And then on the other side, from, you know, left-leaning, some people who would even claim to come from Marxist traditions and so on would also say class is irrelevant now, working class has disappeared and no longer has any kinds of agency. And we wanted to kind of take on some of those arguments and map out and say, actually, they're incorrect. I think that the one that I find really difficult is the idea that the working class has disappeared now in the last few decades and so on, when actually workers across the globe, people who are employed actually are amongst, is at its highest level ever in human history. And what's happened is there's been changes. There's been the offshoring of the industrial workers into a new working class is being formed in Southeast Asia and in South America and other places. But also as well, the class relationships have still maintained in the developed economies. And so we can see this when we talk about, for example, we talk about the way that jobs that were traditionally seen as being very kind of privileged, middle class, white collar jobs, university staff, lecturing staff, professors and so on. Again, those of you know, in the UK, we've got this situation where actually UCU have been involved with a number of strikes over the last few months, because we're having, in my case, we're having a third of our pension has been taken away. For younger staff, actually it's up to 50% of the pension rights being taken away. We've had a 20% real terms pay cut in the context of over the last 10 years. And so what we're having is we're seeing the formations of basic working class consciousness within these institutions, which traditionally were seen as being very privileged. And now we have unions being formed and actually taking industrial action in these areas. You know, casualisation is a massive issue as well within universities. 68% of research staff are on fixed-term contracts, which also speaks to kind of the precarity that is a big buzzword over the last kind of 20 years. It's happening in our universities. UCU is one of the ones who are trying to address that now through the action we're taking. But we also wanted, and this links to something else, we also wanted to talk about, and we do this a little bit in the kinds of the research questions we indicated later on. We want to talk about and say that workers aren't powerless, you know, which is another narrative that comes around. Oh, capitalism's changed completely, everything's precarious, you can't do anything, you can't organize, you can't actually fight back, you just have to accept whatever you're being given in terms of terrible working conditions. And one of the things that's most heartening over the last week or so is the Amazon labor union in Staten Island, in JFK 8 warehouse, where, you know, in the bastion of this new form of capitalism, right, where workers and unions are not involved at all, or shouldn't be involved at all, and, you know, in this kind of gig and most precarious forms of employment, there we have it. And indeed, we haven't talked much about intersectionality here yet, maybe we'll do in the discussion, but actually you see who is the guy who's at the forefront of this is a young African-American who's actually involved in organizing the in organizing the union and getting the union vote passed. So finally, what can we do? Well, we did a list of questions and research topics that we thought were relevant. Some of which are traditional ones that we think need reviving, and some of which actually are new that we need to talk more about the kind of the intersectionality and the relationship between different forms of oppression and exploitation, and how that works in terms of what accounting can do. The thing that I suppose I would have liked to have included, fortunately, I look back over the early versions of what we wrote, and we managed to get all the points into. We were twice as long in the first version, but we managed to get everything into in terms of the points that we wanted to make. With the one kind of exception, I would have liked to have talked a bit more about what we can do individually in terms of our praxis as accounting academics. And I know there's another section on impact and engagement, and it's kind of related to all of that. And I think there's a debate about how we relate to or are involved with organized labor and trade unions and what we can do about it. And I'm going to put a link in the chat here about one of my colleagues at Birmingham, or ex-colleagues at Birmingham now, James Brackley, did an analysis, I think last month actually, of the financial statements that were published by the universities at the end of January, and showed within that about how all the financial indicators are going up and staff level of employment is going down, just as a context for this is what's happening with our dispute at the moment. This is what the money is there in the sector, it's not being spent on the staff, and we can help feed into those kinds of financial analysis, which there have been examples of that done in the past, but I think we could do a lot more of that now when it comes to kinds of industrial disputes and when it comes to other campaigns and activities. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Stuart, and thanks everyone. Now we have a good solid 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more if we can still a bit more, but anyway, we can start taking any comments and questions from the audience. So anybody who wants to jump in, just raise your hand or type in the chat as I indicated. So do not be shy. So we put a few links on resources that the speakers have mentioned. Eventually, I will also put previous seminars, future seminars, but for now, we can focus on any of the topics discussed today. And Sebastian, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've been listening to a few sessions, and I've read the manifesto, and I thought it was really amazing. I have basically a question for, I think, Alessandro, Lisa, and Nick, because so I'm in accounting. I'm a postdoc in accounting, but in university I was very active in like queer theory, queer activism stuff that we did there, and there was a time when I at least tried to read Judith Butler, and from how you term the word queer, and when you wrote in the manifesto, like as an alternative to the norm, I was just wondering, like, what exactly do you mean? Because my understanding from queering or queer theory, from at least how I understood, especially Butler, was that it's more about deconstructing what we see as norm, because it's more like a construction of reality. At least that's how I understand. And by deconstructing, we can basically see like heteronormativity, we can see power, we can see how something like a norm became established over centuries, over dynamics. So I was really just interested in understanding how your perspective of queers, or what you understand of queer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebastian, for your question, and it's very relevant. And well, queer theory per se is always very controversial because we don't even know whether it's a theory or not, even different positions within queerness, but they don't agree on what we want to achieve as an ultimate lens. But I do fully agree with you that there is ultimately a deconstructed paradigm which underlines our research and our activities. And this also, actually, we put this together with some sort of positive activism, in the sense that, yes, we want to deconstruct the norms, we want to deconstruct what is heteronormativity in workplaces, in account of workplaces, and so on. But at the same time, we want also to think how we can create multiple realities. So just to make it a bit more accessible to everyone, there is this famous, now very HR way of saying that diversity is inviting you to a party, inclusion is inviting you to dance to a party. But what we want to do as well in our research is to actually rip apart the dance floor and create multiple dance floors, because you want to invite me to dance Bruce Springsteen, but I want to dance Kylie Minogue. And so how do we do this? And so the idea is exactly queering this by ripping the floor apart and creating multiple space and opening up the profession as well. But this, of course, goes through deconstructing the current norms, which is one of the first steps we envision.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? So I have maybe a question for Andy about feminism. You know, we have the discussion about this use of pronouns, and I know that even on your ID you have the X. So I think we even had a kind of a funny incident where we advertised an event for the EAA, and Baha, the EAA, fixed because he thought there was typos, right? Like instead of X, it should be the E of she or E of her. So can you maybe explain that? I'm sure some people have never asked that question, but I'm sure that there will be some curious minds.
So yeah, I get this a lot actually. And this is just my own personal issue. Like I was discussing earlier, the structural systems in which we work have been developed under a patriarchal system. And a lot of the language that we have reflects that. And language is a very powerful socialization tool, right? And I believe, and a lot of social research would indicate that languages help to perpetuate issues that we have in society. And so it's bothersome to me that women are often described, and pronouns are one way of doing this, but just the basic use of the word human. There's all kinds of words, right, that are male-centered and male-normative in their description. And so I just take that power away. And I put in X wherever there would be a male-normative description. And in turn, right, it becomes, and people ask me how it's pronounced. I mean, like, it's irrelevant. You can pronounce it however you'd like. I still pronounce it she and her. I wish I could pronounce it some other way that would make me feel better about it, but I don't. Maybe someday. But the fact is, this is how we work, right? It is in everything that we do. And if you're paying attention to it, and if you work to alter it, it creates a lot of disruption, actually. It's not as accepted as you would think. Most people don't ask, but when they do ask, you get a lot of eye rolling, and that's fine. You don't have to feel that it's free. It's not for everyone, but I do think it's important. And not only am I uncomfortable being described as some subset of male, but I think it's also a good way to draw attention to the fact that it exists, right? So it's not just for females, it is for a lot of things, right? And I think that it's important that we pay attention to language, especially as accountants, providing accounts as we go out and disclosures and talking about all these things. If you go through corporate disclosures, it's amazing how gendered the language is. I mean, we've just gotten to the point of society that we've quit calling people in executive positions chairmen. Well, some people still do, but most of us have gotten to the point where we refer to them as chairpersons, but it's everywhere. And so if you are paying attention and you're drawing attention to it, it does help to change those structures and those systems. I wish we could develop some other word to describe things, and maybe I'll do that next. But at this point, this is where I am on the issue. So.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it's good to make it to make a point on that. So, anyone else? Anybody had a question for any of the speakers?
I've got a question.
Sure, Samira. Yeah.
My question is directed towards Matthew, but anyone else can also contribute. Anyone who's interested in looking at accounting for defense, and given the sensitive nature of the topic, what obstacles or challenges did you face, or you foresee someone who's planning to do research in that space to come across, and what advice would you have for them?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is getting access to information, right? So in one of the first drafts, or the way that I originally wanted to write this was as a sustainability assessment of a Tomahawk missile, just to break down like all the components, where they come from and all that, just to kind of nest it inside of like an environmental accounting lens. Finding what the exact components are of a Tomahawk missile and where they source them from probably got me put onto a NSA list somewhere in the Defense Department with my Google searches. But needless to say, that information isn't just like lying around, right? So finding the raw data you need to make the arguments inside of for an accounting journal, it's difficult. That was one of the reasons why I really liked that cost of war project, because they've done a hell of a lot of legwork in analyzing different costs associated with war, whether it's the ongoing like privatization of war, money spent on building new defense systems, procuring old defense systems, repairing all of that. They've done a lot of groundwork in finding that. And the other thing I'll say about it is like kind of related, the secrecy portion of it, right? So a lot of the whole reason I came across that SFFA S56 statement was because that statement gets used to just kind of blank out things under national security interests, right? And that just means there's not a whole hell of a lot of information out there. So short of trying to skill up on doing FOIA requests for information, which it takes a lot of time and a lot of money, it's difficult to find the information. In my own thinking of it, because access to data is such a problem, I personally wanted to try and do more research that was one-on-one with people inside of the military, through various members of my family and friends that I had when I was growing up. I know a lot of people in the military, And I know other people that know, like, 7 degrees of connection and stuff with people in interesting positions that would have things to say. And I think that that would be a much more fruitful route for data collection if you're trying to do it. But definitely there's a lot of really good work that's been done inside of accounting already that you can, and obviously talking to those authors is a very good idea. Yeah, but access to data, I think, is the biggest difficulty, and not having the NSA knock on your front door for your Google searches. That's another one.
Thank you.
Great. I don't see
Looks on Charles, because all this is getting recorded by the NSA right now.
completely. It's live stream to them. So anybody else?
Could I ask a question? Can a panel member ask a panel member a question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
So Stuart, I was wondering, so when I read y'all's section, I liked a lot of the questions that y'all had laid out. And one of the things, I was reading a paper that Leonardo Rinaldi had just put out about kind of different research topics. He put it out in Accounting Forum about different COVID-19 research topics. And one thing that I was really surprised at was he was talking about how there wasn't a lot of work that had been done inside of management accounting, and there's these sustainability perspectives that hadn't been addressed. But one thing I think you guys note in here is this essential, non-essential worker. I feel at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought that was going to be like a huge point of contestation, whose work is essential and whose isn't. And I was wondering if, just by the fact that you wrote this section and your own, knowing a little bit about your research interests, if you'd come across any kind of research that was kind of honing in on that essential, non-essential work designation that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Matt. It's an interesting one. That I haven't directly. I think so. There's people who've engaged over the years with David Graeber's work. Bullshit Jobs, that book. Which kind of speaks partly to this essential, non-essential. One of the things, again, I suppose I did find a bit heartening. I was reading something over the weekend, which is kind of an analysis of the Irish working class today, and starts off by talking about class. And so you have to say, what are the parameters, criteria, how are you going to define class? And particularly if you're going to move beyond the kind of the surface level things about classes, about income levels, or certain preferences, or which newspapers you read, which is one of the things that the ABC classification was based around marketing through and advertising in newspapers, and that's migrated into sociology and social groups as this is what defines class, of course. Well, I completely disagree with, but one of the things that it did bring out, it was a quote from one of the liberal columnists in the Irish Times. It said, "There's a scepter haunting Europe, and it's the working class." It's back, this idea about essential workers. Was really highlighted in COVID, and I think we need to. There's opportunities here, isn't there, to explore these kinds of ideas about what is it that's going to keep our economies going, or never mind the economies, our societies going. What do we need to do to keep the societies going? And a lot of jobs were either brought into question, and some roles, were kind of said, well, do we really need those people? Are those roles actually essential? So I think that's it brings us back to kind of the central point, I suppose, we were talking about, which is the idea that class is still relevant. It's not gone away. It's not disappeared. it's a category that I think actually we could have a lot of fruitful insights through actually developing more ideas around, and not just the financial analysis of the kind of things that I talked about earlier, but also as well about how is it changing and how is it impacting on the way that capitalism is changing and the way that society is changing now.
So we have time for maybe one more question or comment on the topic. So whoever wants to grab that one from the audience or the panel, please feel free to do so. Anybody else? Oh, no. Okay. Well, I think that if you don't have any more insights, well, this is being, of course, has been recorded. You have the manifesto access. I posted a couple of things, and then we can also announce the last but not least of the seminar, which will be a recap on May 3rd, so next month. It will be co-organized with the ISCAP IPP seminar series with our Portuguese colleagues, and it will be basically us, but it will be really a broad discussion, general discussion on all the seminars that we have done, plus the manifesto and everything we're going to talk about. So I'll put the registration link here on the chat, and then we have time to register. Oh, sorry, there was a question from John. I just saw that. Did you want to ask it, John, directly before we close, or are you going to do it? I just saw this now. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I posted it at the very end. This was just a general sort of closeout question regarding intersectionality and sort of the question of how much we should be doing applied research to solving direct problems as opposed to questioning foundations, because like both are valuable, but they're sort of valuable relative to one another. When there's a lot of people solving practical problems, you need to be more questioning. When lots of people are making good headway questioning, as in queer theory, that implies that it might be a good time to engage in practical solutions. And so I was sort of curious what the panel thought about that from an intersectional standpoint.
So who wants to take that question?
I was going to ping off of that too, because I feel like Stuart mentioned this when he was bringing up the organizer at Amazon Labor for the Amazon Labor Union, Christian Smalls. He doesn't fit the regular profile of an organizer. He got fired, and then a memo came out, and the company was saying that putting more attention on him would be a good thing because it would make Amazon look better because he was inarticulate, uneducated Black man. Yeah. And this guy, within the span of, I think it's 2 years, almost to the date, organized, they still got a long way to go before they get a ratified contract, but at least getting through the first stages of organizing a union against the biggest, company in the US for sure. Shows that maybe, to me, tying this back to John's question here, is about like questioning. To me, it says question the ways that we're approaching these problems. Like he didn't go and get AOC to become the front person for the movement. He was on the ground organizing himself. Yeah, I don't know if Stuart had something he wanted to, because he brought it up earlier.
Just two very quick points in relation to John's question. I think it was important. It's the very first quote, even before we start the manifesto, is the quote from the Aboriginal theorist at the beginning, who were influenced by the Black Panthers in the 1970s. And it was the idea that actually, if you've come here to help me, keep on walking. If you've come here because your liberation is tied up with my liberation, let's sit down and talk. And I thought that's really powerful in terms of the ideas around allyship, because it gets away from the idea that we're separated. We're all together on that. The other thing, just briefly to say on intersectionality and in particular in relation to class. In the UK, where did the Equal Pay Act come from in 1970? female Ford workers going on strike and forcing the Labour government to actually put the legislation through. There's a lovely film, comedy drama called Made in Dagenham in it that covers that. And in a similar vein, the story from miners' strike in 84 and 85, it wasn't just about miners, it wasn't just about traditional cloth cap down the mines and so on. There's a great film called Pride, where a lesbian gay community from London go and raise funds, identify the way that miners are being treated and beaten up by police and harassed by police, and so identify that with their own experience, collect money and go down to the valleys in Wales to deliver that money and the experience that they then go through. Again, comedy drama on that. So, you know, if you want to talk about sectionality on those, there's a good 2 films to go and enjoy this weekend.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I think that would be a good suggestive note to close the event. I know it's late in Melbourne. I want to thank Andy, Matt, Alessandro, Nick, Lisa, and Stuart. Thank you for attending. The video will be distributed to all registrants again, and don't forget the last but not least recap event on May 3rd. I just put the registration link in the chat, but I'm sure you will hear from me again. So again, thank you very much, and you know, let's open accounting in your own research and teaching. So thank you very much. Bye, everybody.